call us witches, they call us damned. But they don't understand the power at hand. For this isn't just play, it's not just a trick. A witch's blood runs deep. And it's fucking thick.
Hey darling, sleeping on the blacktop. Hey darling, running through the trees, honey.
And we want no more like thee. I banish thee from Salem. Forever. Take the girls.
What? No! You can't do that! Get your hands off my sister! This is our home!
Not anymore. The kind Smiths have agreed to take back sisters and turn them right.
I often try during this time of year. It always seems to be a really busy time of year. But one thing that I've tried to do every year is during the month of March, as it is the anniversary of the Salem witch trials, to do my in memory 1692 hashtag. It was inspired by a song that a lady had written. Can't really remember her name. We tend to focus on the phobia of paganism around Halloween, but it is very important that we witches look at history and stand in solidarity with those who were met an unfortunate end, because we have to use YouTube speak nowadays, as well as those that faced torture, ridicule, shunning, and all of those types of things. But to better understand the Puritan way of life, to understand the history, their way of life, their superstitions, as well as their archaic laws. Some have said that the Puritan movement were the founders of what is known as the evangelical movement of today, the Christian nationalist evangelical movement, with such institutions as IBLP and the the documentary known as Shiny Happy People. You watch a lot of videos on cults, such as Cults to Consciousness, and a few other large creators on this platform. You really come to understand as you study Puritan law. So let's get into it, shall we? Religion, rulers, and kings have walked hand in hand since time began, or since the beginning of time. But in Europe, the church the king or the queen in some cases, were the ones who decided what religion would be practiced. There was no religious tolerance or religious freedom during this time. The Catholic Church ruled with an iron fist. The Catholic Church arranged marriages, approved and disapproved of marriages, for they only wished to have unions, especially within the ruling classes, that benefited the church. They would decide who within the noble or privileged classes who went to monasteries, nunneries, that type of thing. Some of the children born of the ruling classes were in fact educated and sent to nunneries, or monasteries, so that they were thoroughly educated in theology when it became their time to rule. The Catholic Church ruled with an iron fist. Heretics, or heresy, was an executionable offense to those who felt that the Catholic religion was not being practiced the way that the bishops, pope, and whoever chose to have it practiced. They did rule every aspect of everyday life during this time period. They would determine even so much as marital relations. A marriage was not legal until the marriage was consummated, or the deed was done, so to speak. And during this time, there would be witnesses in the room, more so with the kings and queens of Europe, would be witnesses in the room. Of course, the bed would be curtained in order to stand and listen to the marriage being consummated. How romantic is that? But the church would even determine with married couples what days of the week, what positions married couples were allowed to have. Clothing was mandatory at one point, and what days of the week a couple could do the deed, so to speak. The tithing, a lot of things that were mandatory within the church, and of course, due to confessions and such, the church knew pretty much everyone's business. But of course, this was not as strictly enforced of those who were of money, of the ruling classes, or of the privileged. Rules and laws were only basically enforced for the poor and the everyday person, because sex was for simply and only for procreation, in order to have children that could possibly serve the church in future monasteries or nunneries. Enjoyment of sex was even considered a sin. So even so much as the procreation, because that's simply what sex was for, simply to acquire more children in order to serve the church. If the marriage was not witnessed, marriages back then had to be witnessed. Witnesses were in the room during the deed. A priest would bless the marriage bed as well as the marriage. And witnesses would stay in the room, although there were curtains around the bed, until the marriage was complete. And in some cases, the sheets with the virgin blood would be presented to the public. And in some cultures, the sheets or the piece of cloth are still presented to the public after marriages. One thing that's shocking is the fact that the church approved child marriages. Some children were married as young as 9, but 12 was considered a legal marriage, although that was something that the church did back then. Queen Matilda was married at age 12. There's a whole list of European leaders, but I'm not really going to go into that. That's kind of not the point of the video, but that was another thing that the Catholic Church approved. You either got married and had kids or went to a nunnery or monastery.
When we think of the Middle Ages, it's impossible to ignore the overwhelming influence of the Catholic Church. It wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was one of the most powerful political and economic forces in Europe. The Church owned vast amounts of land, collected heavy tithes from peasants, and often rivaled kings in wealth and authority. Priests and bishops weren't only religious figures, they were also administrators, judges, and power brokers. The Pope could crown emperors, excommunicate rulers, or call entire kingdoms to war, as seen in the Crusades. Everyday life revolved around religion. Birth, marriage, death, and even the calendar were dictated by the Church. Cathedrals symbolized its grandeur, towering over towns as reminders of divine and earthly dominance. But with such power came corruption, indulgences, political manipulation, and struggles between kings and popes for supremacy. The Inquisition itself shows how deeply the Church enforced control, policing belief and punishing dissent. To the average medieval person, the Church was everywhere, protecting, guiding, but also dominating. Faith was inseparable from power, and questioning the Church often meant risking your life. The Middle Ages weren't just ruled by kings and knights, they were ruled above all by the power of the cross.
The Catholic Church once waged war on cats, blaming them for spreading heresy and bad luck. In the 13th century, Pope Gregory IV declared felines were agents of the devil. This led to mass killings of cats across medieval Europe. People believed that eradicating cats would ward off evil spirits and witchcraft. Ironically, the cat massacre helped rats and mice thrive, fueling the deadly spread of the Black Plague. Millions of people died, all because of a crusade against cats.
Did you know one pope's brutality almost destroyed the Catholic Church forever? In 1378, Urban VI became pope after the papacy returned to Rome from 70 years in France. But within months, he turned into a monster. He screamed at cardinals during meetings, publicly humiliated bishops, and threatened to excommunicate entire kingdoms over minor disagreements. When cardinals tried to calm him down, Urban had 6 of them dragged to papal dungeons. He personally watched as they were tortured, listening to their screams for mercy. His violence was so extreme that the same cardinals who elected him declared his papacy invalid. They elected a rival pope in France, splitting Christianity in half. This began the Western Schism, a 40-year crisis that nearly ended the Church. At one point, 3 different men claimed to be the true pope, each commanding armies fighting across Europe. Urban's response was to declare holy war against fellow Christians, ordering crusades against his rivals. His reign of terror created the greatest crisis in Catholic history, permanently weakening papal authority and almost destroying the unified church that had existed for over 1,000 years.
Why the Catholic Church was so powerful. People in medieval times could not read. They were powerful because they controlled the flow of information. It wasn't until the invention of the printing press and the mass availability of books that people learned how to read and could make their own minds up about the Bible. People that control the flow of information control public consciousness too.
The Catholic Church ruled with coercion, fear, superstition, and spiritual abuse, as well as fear of death. During this time, of course, because people could not read nor write, especially the average person, the Catholic Church, knowing that people lacked any sort of real education, it was quite easy for them to control. During this time, the Catholic Church would offer certain dispensations, hellfire and eternal damnation and hellmouth were the ultimate punishments, as well as time in purgatory. Now, to lessen your time in purgatory, because the church loved money, you would donate goods, seeds, property, even your own children. A child donated to a monastery or nunnery would ensure that you spent no time in purgatory, especially during this time when a lot of the average person could not afford to feed all the mouths that they had, and of course with disease running rampant and such. So a child donated would ensure that you served no time, and children were fed and educated and had the life that they would not have been able to live with parents that couldn't afford to keep them. Although abuses within the church that we won't, rather inappropriate, did happen to these children in some cases. The church needed young bodies to keep the church alive, a endless supply of priests and nuns, and of course they wanted children because children were more malleable, they could be molded and controlled, and of course spread the church doctrine through this practice. And of course during this time, even when more affluent people would pass on, splitting their inheritances, they would see to it that, of course, the church would get donations. At one point in England, the church owned 20 to 30% of all land in England. Of course, since the patriarchy was ruled heavily, anything deemed heresy, anything that went against the church as they deemed it, things like medicine that was not church sanctioned, or science. Galileo was a perfect example of that. A lot of them believed that the earth was flat, and of course Galileo kind of proved that to be misinformation. But anything that went against the church as they saw it, would not benefit the church, was deemed heresy. As I said, any type of healing or science, the church would even control how women gave birth, which is further proof of how the patriarchy ran with a iron fist, because women were not allowed to become doctors, so they had to use herbs and such to help with mothers. And the church deemed that any other practices while a mother was giving birth were deemed sinful, and a midwife could easily lose her life, especially if far too many children died. Of course, the Catholic Church was the ones heavily involved with the Inquisition. Any other religions, Muslim or anything like that, of course, the Jewish religion. So people were constantly executed during this time. Even people that had converted, and the Catholic Church believed that they were still practicing even though they were converted, more than, they were forced or manipulated or bullied into conversion. But if they were still what the church believed practicing, then these people were executed. Many women were executed during this time who were to have been believed as practicing witches. During this time, of course, these women were tortured, and unspeakable things were done to them.
Between 1450 and 1750, the Catholic Church systematically executed around 50,000 women for witchcraft. Their real crime was not sorcery, it was knowledge. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued the papal bull Summus Desiderantes Affectibus, one of the most misogynistic documents in European history. It officially declared that witches were real and must be hunted down and exterminated. 2 years later, Inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger published the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a 500-page manual teaching how to identify, interrogate, torture, and execute suspected women. It became a bestseller. For nearly 200 years, it was the second most printed book in Europe, surpassed only by the Bible. The targets were always the same: healers who understood medicinal herbs, midwives who assisted childbirth, widows who owned property, intelligent women who questioned priests or local authorities. Any woman who made someone uncomfortable could be accused. The trials were designed to be unwinnable. Birthmarks were labeled marks of the devil. Warts were said to be teats used to feed demons. If a woman confessed under torture, she was guilty. If she denied it, she was a lying witch. If she died during torture, it meant the devil had claimed her soul. There was no escape. The torture methods were specifically engineered for women. The vaginal pair was inserted and expanded until it tore internal organs. Iron chairs lined with spikes pierced breasts and genitals. The breaking wheel crushed bones slowly while the victim remained conscious. In Bamberg, Germany, Prince Bishop Johann Georg II ordered the execution of 900
1,500 women in just 10 years. He even built a witch house, a prison designed exclusively for female torture. Executions became public spectacles. In Würzburg, in 1629 alone, 157 women were burned at the stake. Entire towns were left without adult women. In Scotland, about 4,000 women were executed. In Switzerland, nearly 10,000. Across Europe, conservative historical records document at least 50,000 deaths. Modern historians estimate the real number may have reached 100,000, but numbers cannot capture the true horror. Mothers burned alive in front of their children, daughters tortured until they accused their own mothers, entire communities destroyed by religious terror. An institution that preached compassion carried out one of the most systematic campaigns of gender-based violence in European history. If this shocks you, if it disturbs you how fanaticism was used to erase women and destroy ancestral knowledge, follow for more stories history tried to bury.
Sex scandals ran quite frequently, more often than the church would care to admit. Reports of excessive familiarity within convent and monastery walls was reported a lot more frequently than the church would care to admit. And as convents and monasteries were places of refuge and healing, encounters with the opposite sex could and did occur. Pregnancies were hidden quite often. Illegitimate children, secret orgies were things that happened within these walls. Punishments were inconsistent. The more peasant nuns were punished harsher, excommunication being the more popular form of punishment. For the lower nuns and such priests on the lower social scale, but noble-born priests, nuns, were simply given sabbaticals for their indiscretions. Children were born and either sent to relatives or to foundling homes, or in some cases things happened to babies born much darker than we're going to go into. Prostitution occurred within convents quite more often than, of course, the church would care to admit. There are confessions and court records and reports that have still survived, although in convents silence was a very highly enforced rule. The quills told a whole different story when quills came to paper. And when priests would go, especially to the convents, to make sure everything that was pure and pious, would come back with more scandalous accounts as to what was going on. Now, pregnancies did occur within these churches. In one case, a nurse, Agnes, was caught having a rather salacious encounter with a knight who was supposedly receiving healing, caught in her room after clinking was heard. Of course, during this time, nuns especially were getting more creative as a means of explaining these pregnancies. Demonic possession was one explanation for pregnancies. Immaculate conception. One nun who became pregnant reported that she had accidentally fallen on a man and became pregnant. Of course, lack of education on how you become pregnant was clearly not given during this time. So they were having quite the time within these monasteries and these convents. People who could not handle the religious life would come up with very creative ways to run from the convents, although some were brought back and punished harshly, dressing up as priests, or travelers in order to get out of the convent to reunite with family members who didn't donate money or property, of course, so they wouldn't get sent back, or lovers. Some cases, a nun was allowed to keep her children and would raise her children in the convents. I'm sorry. This is just crazy to me. Fell on a man. Okay. So even during this time, while people were starving, abbesses, bishops, cardinals still lived in excess during this time. Boniface VIII and John the 12th, Pope John the 12th, of course, lived in a lot of excess. During this time, high positions in the church could be bought and sold. Of course, Alexander VI, the father of the famous Lucrezia Borgia, had rather a large amount of illegitimate children with different women. Of course, his daughter, he would marry her off, divorce her, and in one case ask the husband, because it was reported that he could not get Lucrezia pregnant, he was asked to basically perform certain adult acts in public to prove that he could, get a soldier to stand at attention. Of course, Lucrezia was technically pregnant, but her father got her out of it. One husband he had murdered. His son Cesare was murdered for his behaviors, so to speak. I'm trying to keep this friendly. And it is believed that Cesare was one of the earliest depictions of Christ with blonde hair and blue eyes, as the story goes. They had a lot of things went on in these monasteries and convents that people knew about but really didn't speak on. Pope Alexander, even for political gain, because when there was political gain, the church gained. He married his 12-year-old son Geoffrey off to a 16-year-old woman to ensure gain within the church. And then, of course, Pope Leo, Giovanni Medici, was having a rather lavish installation party, and he had one young boy painted in pure gold, and the child died as a result. Well, the church did not just rule with coercion, fear, spiritual abuse, superstition. The church also ruled with judgment and hypocrisy. They would enforce rules on the lower classes, rules in which they did not follow themselves, as documents show. Those that were on the lower scale were treated more harshly, and people had starvation and could barely make a living, while a lot of these cardinals, abbesses, and bishops, popes lived in freedom and excess and were not correctly punished by the church.
For nearly 1,000 years, England was loyal to the Catholic Church. But in the late 1520s, King Henry VIII faced an existential crisis. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon produced no surviving male heir, and he feared the Tudor line could collapse into chaos. At the same time, Henry's attention had turned to Anne Boleyn, the daughter of a well-connected family. Henry was infatuated, but unlike her sister Mary, Anne refused to be his mistress. Anne demanded something far more significant: a crown. Henry asked Pope Clement VII to annul his marriage to Catherine, arguing she had been married to his brother. But the Pope hesitated. Catherine's nephew was Charles V, whose imperial army had sacked Rome, leaving the Pope trapped and under the emperor's control. Angering him was not an option, and when the Pope finally refused, the king took matters into his own hands. Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, used Parliament to dismantle papal authority, while his spiritual advisor, Thomas Cranmer, provided the religious justification. Together, the three men pushed through the Act of Supremacy, establishing the Church of England and making the monarch its leader, permanently separating England from Rome. By then, Henry had already secretly married Anne Boleyn, setting in motion one of history's most dramatic reigns, and a personal life that would end with 6 marriages.
Why King Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church? Let's know the 5 actual reasons. 1. Desire for a male heir. Henry's urgent need for a male heir was the primary catalyst. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had produced only one surviving child, Mary. Fearing for his dynasty's future, Henry sought to annul his marriage to marry Anne Boleyn. 2. Papal refusal. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul Henry's marriage, largely due to political pressure from Catherine's nephew, Charles V, Henry felt cornered. This refusal pushed him towards seeking independence from papal authority. 3. Political power. Breaking from Rome allowed Henry to consolidate power. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 declared him the supreme head of the Church of England, enabling him to control church appointments and revenues, thus enhancing his authority over both church and state. 4. Economic motivations. The Catholic Church was one of England's largest landowners, and its wealth was tempting. By severing ties with Rome, Henry aimed to seize church properties and wealth to fund his ambitious policies. 5. Influence of reformist ideas. The rise of Protestantism also influenced Henry, as figures like Anne Boleyn exposed him to reformist ideas, justifying his break with the Catholic Church as a means of religious reform in England.
In 1529, English scholar and linguist William Tyndale was, like Wycliffe, accused of heresy for his translation of the New Testament.
The feeling amongst many of the Protestant reformers, including Tyndale, is that the Bible should be read by every person. It should be in the hands of everyone. And so Tyndale himself set out to make his own translation of the Bible from the original Hebrew and Greek scriptures into an English translation, and even took advantage of the printing press to disseminate his Bible.
But Tyndale's translation was not the only threat facing the Roman Catholic Church. A few years earlier, the English King Henry VIII had become embroiled in a bitter battle with Pope Clement VII over his request for an annulment of his childless marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Henry's desire to take a new young wife would eventually lead to a break with Rome and the creation of the Church of England.
We need to remember that the Protestant Reformation wasn't just a religious battle, it was also a political battle. The Vatican had a lot of power. And as different countries, different kings came to power, they needed the blessing of the Pope at the Vatican to do certain things, like, for instance, get divorced. And when the Pope said no, there were some, like Henry VIII, who said, you know what? I'm going to form my own church, and we're going to have our own clergy and our own hierarchy, and we're going to use the Bible as the foundation of it, and we're going to do our own thing.
The Pope
essentially has investments in England. He is interested in the real estate of England. The church owns land. The church is making money off land in England. If Henry splits from the Roman Church, then the revenues from England aren't going to make it back to Rome. And this is a danger for the Pope.
Henry VIII is the person who is associated with the first production of a Bible in English, but he took some persuading. Henry makes a proclamation in 1530 that says, in essence, you can translate the Bible when I tell you to, and not before.
One of those who disobeyed the much-married monarch's orders was William Tyndale. In 1536, he was tried for heresy, found guilty, and was sentenced to be burned to death at the stake.
William Tyndale died because he made it possible for people to read the Bible in English. And he was still doing translation work in the prison before he was taken for execution. The way that he was killed as a form of mercy, he was strangled before the flames reached him. And this was probably because of some respect that was accorded to him as a great scholar. To translate the Bible into English was a life or death proposition. People died for this cause.
Martin Luther didn't like the Catholic Church and founded the Lutheran Church. Calvin didn't like the Lutheran Church and founded the Reformed or Calvinist Church. Henry VIII didn't like being denied Catholic marriage and founded the Anglican Church. John Smith disliked the Anglican Church and founded the Baptist Church. William Miller didn't like the Baptist Church and founded the Adventist movement. Ellen G. White really liked what William Miller said and founded the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Charles T. Russell didn't like the Adventist Church and founded Jehovah's Witnesses. Joseph Smith disliked the Methodist Church and founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. John Wesley disliked the Anglican Church and founded the Methodist Church. Some pastors didn't like the Methodist Church and founded the Pentecostal Church. Many did not like the Pentecostal Church and founded thousands of churches like Stop Suffering, Assemblies of God, Light of the World, etc. The evangelical movement came from the Baptist Church, while the born-again movement came from the evangelical churches. The born-again faith emerged in the late 1930s in the U.S., and it gained popularity in the 1970s and 1980s, its golden age. There are now 35,000 different so-called Christian religions, each claiming their interpretation of the Bible is the right one.
When people hear the word Calvinism, many think of stern theologians, heavy doctrines, or endless debates around predestination. But for me, Calvinism is not just a system of theology. It is a source of comfort, clarity, and worship. In this video, I want to share why I love Calvinism. At the heart of Calvinism is this: God is sovereign. Every detail of creation, every event in history, every breath I take, it all unfolds according to His will. That may sound intimidating at first, but to me it is deeply comforting. If God is in control, then nothing is random. My life is not left to chance, but rests in the hands of a loving Father. Calvinism reminds me that faith is not about me trying harder, but about God's power and grace. It shifts the focus away from human achievement and onto God's glory. That God-centered perspective fills me with awe. Calvinism is often summarized by the acronym TULIP, but at its core, it's about grace. Radical, undeserved, overwhelming grace. Total depravity reminds me of my need, how far I fall short. Unconditional election reminds me that God chose me, not because of anything I've done, but because of His love. Limited atonement shows the power of Christ's death, effective and complete for His people. Irresistible grace reminds me that when God calls, His call is life-giving and unstoppable. And the perseverance of the saints assures me that God will never let me go. Every point magnifies the mercy of God. Calvinism doesn't shrink grace, it makes grace bigger and stronger. Another reason I love Calvinism is because it gives me assurance. If my salvation depended on me, on my fragile willpower, my imperfect obedience, or my wavering faith, I would be lost. But Calvinism tells me that my salvation depends on Christ. He is the author and the finisher of my faith. He who began a good work in me will carry it to completion. That truth anchors me. It means I can rest in the finished work of Christ rather than constantly fearing that I might fall away. When I see God's sovereignty in all things, it doesn't make me fatalistic. It makes me worship. To know that God rules over galaxies, over history, over nations, and over the smallest details of my life fills me with reverence. It makes every moment of life meaningful. It turns suffering into something purposeful. It turns blessing into reasons for gratitude. It turns theology into doxology. So why do I love Calvinism? Because it exalts God, because it magnifies His grace, because it gives me assurance, and because it leads me to worship. For me, Calvinism is not a cold system. It is a warm fire, a reminder that God is sovereign, Christ is sufficient, and grace is everything. That is why I love Calvinism.
Did you know who John Calvin is? John Calvin, 1509-1564, was a French theologian and a key figure in the Protestant Reformation. He is best known for his development of the theological system called Calvinism, which emphasizes the sovereignty of God, the doctrine of predestination, and the authority of the Bible. Calvin's most influential work, Institutes of the Christian Religion, 1536, laid the foundation for much of Reformed theology. Calvin played a significant role in shaping Protestantism, particularly in Switzerland, where he settled in Geneva and established a religious community that was both a church and a state governed by biblical principles. His teachings influenced various Protestant traditions, including Presbyterianism and the Reformed churches, and his ideas continue to be relevant in Christian theology today.